Welcome to our study of the book of Revelation. We're at part 12 today. So, in part 11, we looked at the introduction of the woman that gives birth to the man child. We saw what the meaning of this passage was. Well, firstly, just to recap, we looked at chapter 12 being the beginning of the second major division um, in the book of Revelation. We looked at how this book was divided into seven parts, each part telling a story of the birth of the church, right up to throughout its struggles and persecutions in the world, and the rapture of the church to the throne of God. So each of these seven parts in the book of Revelation basically tells a very similar story, just from different perspectives. So chapter 12 starts the second major division of the book. So chapters 1 to 11 um, was the first major division of the book, showed the external struggles of the church, the actual persecutions that the church went through, the physical struggles. Chapters 12 to 22 talk about the background, the behind the scenes action of what's going on behind the struggle of the church, right? So we started off this the second major division or major part of the book. So we saw this great sign appear in heaven, chapter 12, verse 1. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. We saw this represented the church or the chosen people of God, both the old dispensation church and the new dispensation church. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. In verse 3, then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. And we saw this relationship between the dragon, which is the arch enemy of Christ, right throughout the Old Testament, the development of this theme throughout the Old Testament, what it means in terms of the book of Revelation. Verse 4, its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. So this we looked at in chapter 11, in episode 11, chapter 12, verse 4, we saw the development of this theme of this dragon and how it developed right from Babylonian thinking all the way to John's day, this constant enmity between this arch enemy of the Christ and the Christ himself, who was the redeemer of mankind. So let's start today with chapter 12, verse 5, in this episode 12 of the book of Revelation. So remember, the dragon was waiting for the woman to give birth, and he wanted to destroy the male child. So she gives birth, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. So um, this verse immediately tells us that this child that we are talking about here, or that John is referring, or that John is seeing in this vision, is the Christ. Because the reference, the quotation in this verse comes from Psalms chapter 2, verse 9. And we know that Psalm chapter 2, verse 9 is a messianic psalm. In other words, it's a prophetic psalm about the coming of Jesus Christ. So the woman is the church, the child is the Christ. Now remember, the woman is represented not as the mother of Christ, not in the sense of Mary, but in the sense of the global church, the eternal church that brings forth the Christ, or rather that allows the entry of the Christ into the world, right? So the moment this child is born, this child is snatched up to heaven. This refers to the ascension of Jesus Christ. And notice that John doesn't deal here with the life of Jesus Christ. He's not really interested in talking about the life of Jesus Christ. I think he did justice to that in his book, or the Gospel of John. But here the focus is on the church and the struggle that the church is going through in the world. So the birth of the Christ, the ascension of Christ to God's throne, the rapture or the taking up of Jesus Christ, or the ascension of Jesus Christ to God's throne, is really an introduction, to this whole scene that he's setting for the struggle that the church is going to go through. So the word that's used here for snatched up, for the child being snatched up to heaven, is the same word that is used for the rapture of the church and the ascension of Jesus Christ to heaven. First Thessalonians chapter 4 verse 17 speaks about the rapture of the church. Second Corinthians chapter 12 verse 2 speaks about Paul himself being caught up in the third heaven. So there's that's the same word that's being used. So really, the meaning I think behind that is this whole process of the rapture, the ascension. It's this whole being caught up into the spiritual world that John is actually describing here. Now, before we move forward with this, with the rest of the chapter, I'd like to just point out again, for those who hold to the pre-tribulational view, who see chapter 4 verse 1 as the tribulation, the rapture having happened, and everything that comes after chapter 4 verse 1 as things that would happen in the future after the rapture. Here's an example, chapter 12, an example of why this is not true, because here John is seeing a vision of a woman who births the Christ, and obviously a reference to the birth and the rapture, so the birth and the ascension of Jesus Christ. So this could not possibly be happening after the rapture. It couldn't possibly be happening during the tribulation. So this is not a reference to a time that is occurring within the tribulation, right? So this is why, for me, my view, and something that I teach our church and others who chat with me, that the book of Revelation for me does not represent a post-tribulational view, and especially chapter 4 verse 1 is not a reference to the rapture having taken place. Right, so we find this verse 5 is definitely a reference to Jesus Christ. The quotation here from Psalm chapter 2 verse 9, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Again, the ascension of Jesus Christ, sitting at the right hand of God. Verse 6, the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So again, the reference here to the church escaping the persecution or the tribulation that's to come from, or trying to escape the tribulation of the dragon, or the persecution of the dragon. This reference to a flight to the desert it's echoed quite often in the Old Testament, or this is rather an echo of Old Testament passages. So if you compare Elijah's flight to the desert, 1 Kings chapter 17 verses 1 to 7, also in chapter 19 verses 1 to 8, this is a reference to, it's a parallel, I would say, of Elijah's flight to the desert. In fact, the 1,260 days is very similar to Elijah's time that he spent in the desert. And I think the church would have been very familiar with this concept. 1,260 days is a 3.5 year period, right? So that's exactly what Elijah spent in the desert. But it also reminds the church of Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt in Matthew chapter 2 verse 13, when Herod was trying to kill the baby Jesus, and Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt to try and keep Jesus safe. But also, I think the greater reminder is this time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, during the 400 silent years in between Malachi and Matthew, and we read this in the book of the First Maccabees, chapter 2, verse 29. This time of 3.5 years of persecution that the Jewish nation went through, absolute atrocities. We've discussed this in the past. And something else I think that was even more pertinent to the church was this flight of the church to Pellagra. Now, during the destruction of the temple in AD 70, remember Jesus prophesied this. Jesus said that there would come a time when there'd be not a single stone of the temple left standing. And he was talking about this particular time when Jerusalem was destroyed, or Jerusalem was attacked. And Eusebius writes about it, but Jesus prophesied about it in Mark chapter 13, verse 14. But the church fled. The church, Eusebius, in fact, one of the historians of the church, he says that the church in a vision was warned of this impending attack on Jerusalem. So most of the church fled to the desert, to Pellagra, and they went and lived in the desert until it was safe to return to Jerusalem. So this happened in AD 70. So this flight to the desert, definitely a reference to to this time when the church fled. And the Christians fled Jerusalem just to try and to keep safe, to escape this time of persecution. But it was this time of 1,260 days, 3.5 years of persecution, 3.5 years of trying to keep safe and escaping persecution. Now, the 3.5 years, again, is not a physical time period. We must not get caught up in actual time periods. Don't allow yourself to get to the space where you think that it's referring to a physical 1,260 days. It's a symbolic representation of a time of persecution. Whenever people spoke about the 1,260 days or the 3.5 years or a times and a half, times and a half, yes, it was always a reminder in the Jewish mindset of the days of persecution that the church experienced, whether it was Elijah fleeing to the desert, whether it was the persecution of Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes on the nation of Israel, or on Jerusalem, whether it was the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, but it reminded people of this time of persecution. So when John is writing and when he's talking about this time of persecution, he's talking about a time when the Romans were persecuting the church. There was definite persecution that was going on, severe persecution that was going on. So definitely something that we must remember here, that the church flees into the desert, into the wilderness, but it says it's a place that's prepared by God. Chapter 12 verse 6. The wilderness was a place prepared by God. In other words, God prepares a space for the church to keep safe. Now, yes, the individual believers, thousands of them were killed. They were martyred. They were persecuted severely. It does not mean that the church was destroyed. Remember, the greater the persecution that the church went through, the greater the faith of the church developed, and the more people came to know Jesus Christ, and the more people turned to Christianity. It had the opposite effect. Instead of destroying the church, it actually built the church, and it brought more people to know Jesus Christ. Verse 7, there's an interesting verse to read. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient snake called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Now, this is very interesting. Now, I'm going to tell you why this is such an interesting verse for me, because if you read through the Old Testament, you don't get this idea of Satan the way we look at him today. Today, Satan is this the seducer, the person who brings all of the trial on the church, the one who's always trying to trip you up, right? But if you read through the Old Testament, there seems to be this very complex relationship between Satan and God. In fact, if you look at the very, very earliest references to Satan's fall from heaven, Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12, the book of 2nd Enoch chapter 29 verse 4 and 5, 1 Timothy 3 verse 16 as well, we see that Satan occupied, or there's this thinking that Satan occupied this position of authority and privilege in the kingdom of God, or in this heavenly sphere. In fact, he was called a cherub, and we know from previous studies that the cherubs were the highest order of angels. Michael was a cherub, is a cherub. Gabriel, and we named all of the 7 archangels in a previous study, or one of the previous episodes. But Satan used to be one of these cherubs. Someone who served in a very, very high standing position. And we see in Isaiah chapter 14 verse 12, it seems to be a reference to his fall because of pride. And Enoch, in fact, this book of 2nd Enoch, even though it's not in the Bible, this book, but it tells a story of Satan's fall and how his pride costed him his place in heaven, and he fell. And he was relegated to the domain of the air. Now, we don't really know exactly what that means, but Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2 seems to indicate that he lost his place in heaven and he was relegated to this domain of the air. It's called the prince of the air. But we also see Satan appears in the presence of God in Job chapter 1, verse 11 and 12, Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Satan appears in the presence of God with the other sons of God. And it's kind of like you ask, what's going on here now? Because he lost his place in heaven as this anointed cherub, as this highest order of angels, but he still appears with the other angels when they present themselves before God. So it sounds like he didn't become Satan immediately. It's like as though he lost his position of grace as an anointed cherub, but he was still somehow involved in this relationship with God like the rest of the angels were, because he appears with them. But we find that he's described as the accuser, or someone who speaks against the people of God, always bringing these accusations against the people of God. Now, the interesting thing here is that this word Satan in Hebrew is not a name. It actually means adversary. In fact, the word is used outside of Satan himself quite often in the Old Testament, and this for me is quite a quite a revelation, because it's used to refer to people, right? It's even used to refer to an angel once. If you remember the story of Balaam and the talking donkey, the angel stands in front of the donkey to prevent Balaam's passage through this narrow ravine. And the angel, the Hebrew word for the angel is the word Satan. The angel was seen as an adversary against Balaam and the donkey. So the word is used as an adversary. And in the Old Testament, this word later on, as the history of the Old Testament developed, it became a proper noun that was used for Satan himself, right? This archangel, or this arch enemy of Jesus Christ, or the Christ. And but it actually means an adversary. So if you read books and chapters like Numbers chapter 22 verse 22, 1 Samuel chapter 29 verse 4, 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 4, 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 14 and 23, we find David is he's seen as having adversaries, and sometimes he didn't have any adversaries. Hezekiah, there were other kings who marched against him, and they were called Satans, right? Adversaries against him. So the word adversary used quite often in the Old Testament, or the word Satan used quite often in the Old Testament, but not necessarily as a name for Satan, but as a word that describes an adversary. And we find this very, very beautiful picture of this adversary, where Satan is actually the adversary in Zechariah chapter 3. We find that the high priest, he's being accused by Satan in Zechariah chapter 3 before God, and all sorts of accusations are brought against him. But the angel of the Lord, the Malach Yahweh, stands as a defense of this high priest, right? And we know from previous studies that the Malach Yahweh, or the angel of the Lord, whenever we see that term being used in the Old Testament, we believe it's an Old Testament reference, or the appearance of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, the second person of the Trinity. So beautiful picture of Satan, who accuses the priesthood, accuses the people of God before, or brings accusations against the people of God before God. But Jesus Christ standing as a mediator, defending his people, defending his church. And this is exactly the picture of Jesus Christ right throughout the New Testament. That's why he came. And this is why Satan is the arch enemy of the Christ, because remember, we as the church are the center of the battle. We are the reason for the battle. Jesus came to redeem us as the church, but the enemy is constantly trying to bring us into disfavor with God. And that's exactly what he did with Job. He thought he could, when he appeared before God in the book of Job, he was saying to God, this man will not stand, he will not be able to survive, or his faith will not be able to survive if you persecute him. And God proved him wrong. Satan threw all sorts of persecutions against Job, but Job remained faithful, right? So Satan is this accuser. But we find that the character, so before I go there, we in the Old Testament, it seems like Satan, even though he has fallen from grace, but he's still used by God for God's purposes, right? He was still, he would, even though he was the accuser of the church, he was the accuser of the people of God, but it seems as though his jealousy was growing, and he was constantly accusing the people of God, but Jesus in the Old Testament, the Malach Yahweh, was always the one who defended the church, defended the people. But we find that even though he was doing these things, it was always under the jurisdiction of God. He could not go against God's will. So we find that example in Job. Even though he wanted to try Job, he couldn't do it without God's permission. And God gave him strict guidelines in terms of how that persecution was supposed to happen. So that's an encouragement for us as a church, even today. The devil does not have free reign to persecute you anyhow he wants. He is only allowed to bring trial your way according to the allowance, let's say, of God. God will only allow a certain amount of persecution that he knows you can deal with. Now that for me is very encouraging, because it tells me that whatever comes my way, God has confidence in me that I can handle it. That's why he allows it. Otherwise, he won't allow it in my life, right? So, but we find that when we reach the New Testament, it sounds as though Satan's character has kind of like deteriorated quite a bit, because in the New Testament, he gets introduced to us as the devil or slanderer. So he's no longer just an adversary. He's now become this devil. The word devil is actually used now to describe Satan. And he's also called a slanderer. It seems as though his character has fallen from different heights. At first, he was this anointed cherub. He was this amazing, beautiful archangel, was created with musical instruments in him. He was perfect. He was pure. He was amazing to look at. But prideful his heart, he fell. And he was cast out of this position of being this anointed cherub. But still, there was no repentance, there was no improvement, and this is just my opinion, but this is what it looks like from just trying to study a little bit of Satan's history in the Old Testament. And then when we reach the New Testament, sorry, even in the intertestamental period, with the books like Enoch written and Maccabees, the period between Malachi and Matthew, it seems as though Satan has deteriorated to this point of being this evil slanderer, this person who actively not just persecutes but actively tries to trip up the church, tries to destroy their character and their always trying to seduce the church, right? So he's become the slanderer and the seducer, and he's actively involved in this moral assault against mankind. In fact, in Matthew chapter 4 verses 1 to 11, Mark chapter 1 verse 13, Luke chapter 4 verses 2, 3, 5, 13, we see this description of him as the slanderer, as this devil. And even if you look at Satan's interaction with Jesus, with the apostles, with the New Testament church, you can see that he's constantly trying to destroy their ethics, destroy their morality, trying to bring them down, trying to bring them to the space where they fall apart, so to speak. So if you read John chapter 13 verse 2 and 27, Luke chapter 22 verses 3 and 31, Acts chapter 5 verse 3, he's the one who convinces Ananias and Sapphira to lie to the apostles. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 2 verse 11, Luke chapter 13 verse 16, Acts chapter 10 verse 38, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 7, Matthew chapter 13 verse 39, Mark chapter 4 verse 15, Luke chapter 8 verse 12. All of these verses show the active assault of Satan against the church, against the people of God, even against Jesus himself. So, in my opinion, this shows a gradual regression, a falling away in the relationship that the devil has with heaven. So, and then we come to this passage in Revelation 12, where we find there's this war that breaks out, and Satan is cast out of heaven. So it sounds to me that he started off with this pride. He falls from this position of being an archangel. He becomes the adversary that stands up against the people of God. But again, that development even in the Old Testament, as him being the dragon that stands up as the archenemy against the Christ, against the Malach Yahweh, or the Christ, the Messiah that would come. And this concept of the Antichrist we saw last week, sorry, in the last episode, part 11, sorry, where this development of this theme of the dragon as the arch enemy of the Christ, right? And it seems like it develops from there. But we find here in chapter 12, verse 10, that there's this war that breaks out, chapter 12, verses 10 to 12, that this war breaks out in heaven. Michael and the archangel fight against the dragon, and he seems to have gathered support from other angels, and so those angels join Satan in this battle, and they get cast out of heaven. Now, it's interesting that the book of Revelation, in fact, it's the only book that speaks about this particular war that cast Satan out of heaven. And it seems like it only happened after the ascension of Jesus to heaven. Now, this is very interesting for me. Now, I know that you can't always tie in a chronological timeline to the book of Revelation, because the sequence of events sometimes is not chronological. It's not always in a particular date order. But it sounds to me like that the ultimate showdown that happened between the Christ and the dragon happened after the ascension of Jesus Christ to heaven, because up until that time, the devil was always trying to bring Jesus down right throughout his earthly walk. In fact, if you read through the Gospels, you'll find that there's this indication that Jesus was consistently tempted right throughout his life on earth by the enemy. He was consistently tempted. He was always tempted. He was always seduced, and always there was this attempt to bring him down, but the devil never succeeded. The final blow to the enemy was when Jesus went into hell and death and took the keys of hell and death from the enemy. So in other words, Satan was no longer in charge of the pit. He was no longer in charge of the abyss, or this place called hell, or this place called death. In other words, death and the grave no longer had any importance for the believer, because Jesus had the keys. So that was the final showdown. So when he could not get what he wanted by destroying the Christ, that's when war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his archangels basically won the battle. And Michael the archangel and his angels that follow him, or that fight with him, cast Satan out of heaven together with his angels, right? And then those angels became demons when they fell to, but they were thrown to the earth. This is very, very important, because now he becomes the ruler of the carnal world. So something that we must see, that it's the blood that was shed on the cross that is the ultimate victory. The cross was the final victory. This battle that we see happens in heaven is really the ousting of Satan out of the presence of God completely, right? So no longer even he's even able to appear amongst the sons of God. He's now cast out completely. But what brought that ultimate victory for mankind was the blood of Jesus Christ on the cross. Now, why is that significant? Because remember, up until this point, Satan acted as the adversary who was consistently trying to bring people into disrepute with God. He was always accusing people. He was always trying to slander them, always trying to bring them down in the eyes of God. Remember, where is this coming from? Well, from pride, for one, but also this severe form of jealousy, because he occupied a principal position in the kingdom of heaven, in the presence of God. He was an archangel. He was a cherub, a covering cherub. But when he lost that position and mankind became, now we don't know when he lost that position. It could have been before the creation of man. Because remember, in the Garden of Eden, Satan enters the serpent and he's already seducing Eve. Right, so at that point he was already out of this position of grace with God. So we know that even in the garden, he was already cast out of that position of cherub. But right throughout the history of mankind, he's constantly been trying to seduce mankind, trying to trip them up, trying to destroy their relationship with God. And finally, what happens? Jesus comes and gives his life, and he sheds his blood on the cross, and the blood on the cross now covers all of humanity who comes to him. Right? Anyone who comes to Jesus is now covered under the blood. So what does that mean? It means that regardless of how Satan tries to accuse us, that accusation does not stick anymore, because the blood is a once and for all forgiveness of the sin of humanity. Right? Which means for me, as a believer, my sins past, present, and future are forgiven because I'm covered under the blood. Which means that Satan no longer has the authority to be an accuser. If he is no longer able to be an accuser, he cannot appear in the presence of God, because that's all he could do in the past. He was just trying to trip up humanity. Now he doesn't even have that. Jesus won that battle for me once and for all on the cross. Now, do you understand how important the cross is? Do you understand how important the blood of Jesus Christ is? Because for us, that has brought us this amazing relationship with God, where Satan himself cannot in any way interfere. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Why? Because Jesus shed his blood for us because of that. So that for us is the ultimate victory. The blood that covers the sin, the blood that completely and totally protects me against the accusations of Satan. So there was no grounds for him anymore. So his defeat was final. Now, something that John, I think, is also trying to show here is that martyrdom is the ultimate show of loyalty. A martyr's sacrifice is the ultimate conquest of Satan. So, in other words, when someone has given his life for the sake of the gospel, it's the ultimate sacrifice, but it's also the ultimate victory. Because for Satan, he no longer in any way can claim any form of victory over that person, right? So it's not just about losing one's life. This is important to understand about martyrdom. It's not just about losing one's life. It's about the great principle of the gospel message. And what is that? This principle of the gospel message is this loyalty that we have to Christ, and that we choose to have to Christ, over that we choose over comforts, and we choose over convenience, right? So everything about our lives is not so much about what's suitable for us, what's convenient for us, what's comfortable for us. No, it's about how we choose our loyalty to God, our loyalty to Christ above our own comfort. What does that mean? It means that even when sometimes it means it's uncomfortable for us, so sometimes it means that we have to lose something in order to stand up for Christ, our loyalty is what stands out more than anything else. In fact, if you want to read more about this, John chapter 12, verse 25, Matthew chapter 10, verse 39, Matthew chapter 16, verse 25, Mark chapter 8, verse 35, Luke chapter 9, verse 24, also chapter 17, verse 33 of Luke. All of them speak about this principle of the gospel, us choosing to be loyal to Christ over and above our own comfort and our own convenience. So let's go back to the passage. And so we find that he was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. And then verses 10 to 12 speak about the joy and the celebration. Now let's read it. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony." So you see that it's the blood that the blood of Jesus Christ that covers us, that is the ultimate triumph over Satan. and the word of their testimony. What is that? It is our confession of the, or our rejoicing in this relationship we have with God, our us being able to speak of the amazing relationship we have with God. Our testimony is our witness, our story of our of who God is to us and what God has done for us. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death, right? So this is the ultimate triumph, that people are willing to give up their lives for the sake of the gospel. Therefore, rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. Right? So basically, Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and the demons, and cast him out of heaven, or cast him out of the spiritual realm, out of the presence of God. Now they are relegated to the earth. So Satan has become almost the ruler of the carnal world, right? So it is no longer in this heavenly realm, but he's been thrown out. So now let's look at what he does. So when the dragon, verse 13, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So now he couldn't get to the Christ, because the Christ had won the victory on the cross. He was raptured, or ascended to God, and so he lost that battle. So what does he do? He decides to go after the woman, in other words, after the church, the elect people of God, or the saved people of God. So the so he pursues the woman, and he tries to persecute her. Now this persecution is seen right throughout the history of the church, from the time that Jesus left, from the time that Jesus ascended to heaven. Satan has always been trying to persecute the church, always been trying to destroy the church. Now listen to verse 14. The woman was given the two wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and a half a time. Times, and a half a time. What is that? 3.5 years, right? 1,260 days. That is the period of persecution. Remember, we said that this period always represents a time of persecution, so that she might be protected, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and a half a time, out of the snake's reach, out of the dragon's reach. The word snake here is being used very specifically, I believe, because it's relating the story of the Garden of Eden, where the snake came and tempted Eve. So again, this picture of that very, very first prophecy of Jesus in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where the snake is being cursed by God, and where that first prophecy comes in, saying that Jesus would bruise his head, and he would attack the heel of the Messiah. So out of the snake's reach. Then from his mouth, the snake spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. So whenever we read of the dragon in the Old Testament, you'll always find that there's this, it's related to water. The dragon Leviathan, for example, it was a sea dragon, because the dragon seems to have always been related to a flood. So the enemy always comes like a flood, right? So it's almost, there's this concept of water, flood waters that that are related to the dragon, and we find here it spews out some like a river or a flood against this woman, the woman that is a representation of the church. But notice that she is given wings. She is transported away on the wings of eagles. Now, in the Old Testament, eagle's wings were always a symbol of the intervention and the protection of God. In fact, in Exodus chapter 19, verse 14, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 11 and 12, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31, we find this reference to eagle's wings, always the protection, the intervention of God. So here again, we find the church is given wings to escape the attacks of the dragon. Now notice that the church is being winged away, or she's being caught away in flight to escape to a place that's prepared for, a place that protects her. And I'm going to show you how this is not talking about individual believers, right? Um, there's a distinction here that's being made between the individual believer and the institution of the church. So the woman is a representation of the institution, in other words, the global church, the bride of Christ. And later on, we're going to find that her offspring are being referred to, and those are the individual believers. But we'll talk a little bit about that just now. So again, even in the Babylonian myths, the Tiamat, and we find even Leviathan, like I said in the Old Testament, they were always associated with the sea. The dragon was associated with the sea, and so we find this dragon spews out a flood of waters to try and overtake the woman as she's fleeing. But notice what happens. There's this swallowing up of the flood waters that happens by the earth. In other words, the earth opens up and swallows the flood waters, showing again, even nature, God will even use nature to protect his church, right? And history is written by God for the protection of his church. We're going to see that, even in later chapters of this book of Revelation, the story is all about how God protects his church, how God shelters his church from destruction. So the Old Testament is full of imagery that associates water and floods with the enemy. In Psalm chapter 42 verse 7, Psalm chapter 32 verse 6, Psalm 124 verse 4, and even Isaiah chapter 43 verse 2, we find references to flood waters as an indication of the enemy coming against believers or coming against people who are committed to God. But like I said, God will protect his church. Even if he uses nature to do it, he will protect his church. Now, we find that, but the earth, verse 16, but the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. And that's the end of this chapter. So I said to you just now that John seems to be making a distinction here between the individual believers. So here is referring to the rest of her offspring. These are now the individual believers that are part of the church. So the woman is symbolizing the church as an institution, the global church, the bride of Christ. Now notice that the church is seen as being protected from the time of persecution. What does that mean? Because if the individuals are going through persecution, surely that means that the church is going through the persecution, right? So how do we make this distinction? So I think what John is actually trying to say here is that the church as an institution is not destroyed. So in fact, if you look at it, no other institution in the history of mankind has grown and has developed the way the church has over the last 2,000 years. In fact, one of the great claims to Jesus' divinity today is the fact that no man, no human in the entire history of the world has been able to impact and affect the world and time and space like Jesus has. Right? So the church is a reflection of that. The church is the evidence of that. So even right throughout, from the time Jesus ascended, from the time Satan was cast out of heaven and relegated to the earth, he's been attacking the church. He's been trying to destroy the church, but he cannot destroy the bride of Christ. The bride of Christ is protected by God. The church is protected by God. He can take the lives of individual believers, but we've even seen early on that martyrdom, even if he costs the lives of believers, it does not mean that he's destroying the church, because the blood of the martyrs are like seed that's planted and it springs up more believers, or bears forth more believers, right? In fact, that was a quote by one of the church historians where it talks about the blood of the believers, the blood of the martyrs being the seed that springs up or grows up more believers, thousands more in their place. So even though he might destroy an individual believer, but he's not destroying the church. So he goes off and he wages war against the rest of our offspring. That's the individual believers. And we are seen as offspring. The individual believers are seen as the offspring of the church. The individual members of the church as the offspring of this global body, the institution of the church. Those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. In other words, every person who's committed to Jesus Christ. Now, just a note again, I think I've mentioned this before in previous episodes. Remember, Jesus does not see denominations. We are talking about one global body of Christ. Whether you are Catholic or Methodist or Anglican or Pentecostal or Charismatic or Baptist, it doesn't really matter. There's no distinction of denomination with Jesus Christ. When Jesus sees his church, he sees one bride. We might separate ourselves into denominations and into different divisions or amongst within the church, but God does not see that. God sees the bride of Christ. We are seen as one global institution, one body. The woman here is a representation of the global body of Christ. So thank you for joining me with this chapter or episode 12, chapter 12, episode 12 of the book of Revelation. Now I'm going to release shortly chapter 13. Now I want to warn you, chapter 13 is going to be a bit of a long episode to deal with. There's a lot of stuff in there that we have to deal with that is current for us today, especially around the coronavirus, the pandemic itself, the vaccines associated with that, the conspiracy theories around vaccines, the concepts of the 666 and the mark of the beast. But we're going to discuss that. We're going to look at that in chapter 13. It's going to be an exciting episode. So just gear yourself mentally. It's going to be a bit of a long episode, but I believe all of us will enjoy it. Thank you for joining me. I'm glad that you're part of the study with us, and I hope you're learning a lot with us. God bless you.